Enhancing the functionality of biological brains is a third route to a greater intelligence than what is now possessed by humans. In theory, selective breeding might be used to do this without use of technology. However, any attempt to launch a traditional large-scale breeding program will face tough ethical and political obstacles. Furthermore, it will take several generations to see noticeable results unless the selection was really strong. Biotechnology advancements will provide far more direct control of human genetics and neurology long before such an attempt will be successful, making any human breeding program pointless. Therefore, we will concentrate on techniques that have the potential to produce outcomes more quickly within a few generations or fewer. There are several strategies to improve our individual cognitive abilities, including more established techniques like education and training. Low-tech measures, including improvement maternal and infant nutrition, reducing lead and other neurotoxic pollutants from the environment, eliminating parasites, ensuring enough sleep and exercise, and preventing disorders that impact the brain can all help to promote neurological development. Each of these methods can definitely lead to improvements in cognition, but the magnitudes of the benefits are likely to be modest, especially in populations that are already comparatively well-nourished and educated. None of these methods will likely lead to superintelligence, but they could make a marginal difference by helping the privileged and broadening the pool of available talent around the world. Greater improvements might come from biomedical innovations. There are existing medications that, at least in some people, are said to enhance memory, focus, and mental capacity. Future supplements may provide clearer advantages and fewer negative effects while maintaining the varied, marginal, and usually disputed efficacy of the current generation of such medications. And on the other hand, it doesn't seem like that one could suddenly increase intellect in a healthy person by injecting some chemical into their brain, both from a neurological and evolutionary perspective. The human brain's ability to function cognitively depends on a complex orchestration of many factors, especially during the crucial stages of embryonic development. It's much more likely that in order to improve the self-organizing structure, care must be taken to balance, tune, and cultivate it rather than simply injecting it with a foreign substance. Manipulation of genetics will provide a more powerful set of tools than psychopharmacology. Consider again the idea of genetic selection. Instead of trying to implement a eugenics program by controlling mating patterns, one could use selection at the level of embryos or gametes. Pre-implementation genetic diagnosis has already been used during in vitro fertilization procedures to screen embryos produced for monogenic disorders such as Huntington's disease and for predisposition to some late onset disease such as breast cancer. It has also been used for sex selection and for matching human leukocyte antigen type with that of a sick sibling who can then benefit from a cord blood stem cell donation when the new baby is born. The range of traits that can be selected for or against will expand greatly over the next decade or two. A strong driver of progress in behavioral genetics is the rapidly falling cost of genotyping and gene sequencing. Genome-wide complex trait analysis using studies with vast numbers of subjects. It is now starting to become feasible and will greatly increase our knowledge of the genetic architectures of human cognitive and behavioral traits. Any trait with a non-negligible heritability, including cognitive capacity, could then become susceptible to selection. Embryo selection doesn't require a deep understanding of the causal pathways by which genes in complicated interplay with environments produce phenotypes. It requires only data on the genetic correlates of the traits of interest. It's possible to calculate some rough estimates of the magnitude of the gains obtainable in different selection scenarios. For example, this table shows expected increases in intelligence resulting from various amounts of selection, assuming complete information about the common additive genetic variants underlying the narrow sense hereditability of intelligence. With partial information, the effectiveness of selection would be reduced, though not quite to the extent one might naively expect. Unsurprisingly, selecting between larger numbers of embryos produces larger gains, but there are steeply diminishing returns. Selection between 100 embryos doesn't produce a gain anywhere near 50 times as large as that which one would get from selection between two embryos. Interestingly, the diminishment of returns is greatly abated when the selection is spread over multiple generations. Thus, repeatedly selecting the top 1 in 10 over 10 generations, will produce a much greater increase in the trait value than a one-off selection of 1 in 100. The problem with sequential selection, of course, is that it takes longer. If each generational steps takes 20 or 30 years, then even just 5 successive generations will push us well into the 22nd century. And long before then, more direct and powerful modes of genetic engineering will most likely be available. There is, however, a complementary technology, one which, once it has been developed for use in humans, will greatly potentiate enhancement power of pre-implementation of genetic screening, namely the derivation of viable sperm and eggs from embryonic stem cells. The techniques for this have already been used to produce fertile offspring in mice and gamete-like cells in humans. Substantial scientific challenges remain, however, in translating the animal results to humans and in avoiding epigenetic abnormalities in the derived stem cell lines. According to one expert, these challenges might put human application 10 or even 50 years in the future. With stem cell derived gametes, the amount of selection power available to a couple could greatly increase it. In current practice, an in vitro fertilization procedure typically involves the creation of fewer than 10 embryos. With stem cell derived gametes, a few donated cells might be turned into a virtually unlimited number of gametes that could be combined to produce embryos, and which could then be genotyped or sequenced, and the most promising one chosen for implantation. Depending on the cost of preparing and screening each individual embryo, this technology could yield a several-fold increase in the selective power available to couples using in vitro fertilization. More importantly still, stem cells derived gametes would allow multiple generations of selection to be compressed into less than a human maturation period. And by enabling iterated embryo selection, this is a procedure that would consist of these steps. Now I'm sharing them with you. In this manner, it will be possible to accomplish 10 or more generations of selection in just a few years. The procedure would be time-consuming and expensive. However, in principle, it will need to be done only once rather than repeated for each birth. The cell lines established at the end of the procedure could be used to generate very large numbers of enhanced embryos. The impact of this technology will be dampened and delayed by several factors. There is the unavoidable maturational lag while the final selected embryos grow into adult human beings. At least 20 years before an enhanced child reaches full productivity, longer still before such children come to constitute a substantial segment of the labor force. Furthermore, even after the technology has been perfected, adoption rates will probably start out low. Some countries might prohibit its use altogether on moral or religious grounds. Even where selection is allowed, many couples will prefer the natural way of conceiving. Willingness to use IVF, however, would increase if there were clearer benefits associated with the procedure, such as a virtual guarantee that the child will be highly talented or free from genetic predispositions to some kind of disease. Lower healthcare costs and higher expected lifetime earnings would also argue in favor of genetic selection. As use of the procedure becomes more common, particularly among social elites, there might be a cultural shift toward parenting norms that present the use of selection as the thing that responsible, enlightened couples do. Many of the initially reluctant might join the bandwagon in order to have a child that is not at a disadvantage relative to the enhanced children of their friends or colleagues. Some countries might offer inducements to encourage their citizens to take advantage of genetic selection in order to increase the country's stock of human capital, or to increase long-term social stability by selecting for traits like docility, obedience, submissiveness, conformity, risk aversion, or cowardice outside the ruling clan. Effects on intellectual capacity would also depend on the extent to which the available selection power will be used for enhancing cognitive traits. Those who do not opt to use come from some form of embryo selection would have to choose how to allocate the selection power at their disposal. And intelligence would, to some extent, in competition with other desired attributes such as health, beauty, personality, or athleticism. Iterated embryo selection, by offering such a large amount of selection power, would alleviate some of these trade-offs, enabling simultaneous strong selection for multiple traits. However, this procedure would tend to disrupt the normal genetic relationship between parents and children, something that could negatively affect demand in many cultures. With further advances in genetic technology, it may become possible to synthesize genomes to specification, obviating the need for large pools of embryos. DNA synthesis is already a routine and largely automated by technology, so it's not yet feasible to synthesize the entire human genome that could be used in a reproductive content, not least because of still unresolved difficulties in getting the epigenetics right. But once this technology has matured, an embryo could be designed with the exact preferred combinations of genetic inputs from each parent. Genes that are present in neither of the parents could also be spliced in, including alleles that are present with low frequency in the population, but which may have significant positive effects on cognition. One intervention that becomes possible when human genomes can be synthesized is genetic spell checking of an embryo. Each of us currently carries a mutational load with perhaps hundreds of mutations that reduce the efficiency of various cellular processes. Each individual mutation has an almost negligible effect, yet in combination, such mutations may exact a heavy toll on our functioning. Individual differences in intelligence might to a significant extent attributable to variations in the number and nature of such slightly deleterious alleles that each of us carries. With gene synthesis, we could take the genome of an embryo and construct a version of that genome free from the genetic noise of accumulated mutations before. If one wished to speak provocatively, one could say that individuals created from such proofread genomes might be more human than anybody currently alive, and they would be less distorted expression of human form. Such people would not all be carbon copies because humans vary genetically in ways other than by carrying different deleterious mutations. But the phenotypical manifestation of a proofread genome may be an exceptional physical and mental constitution with elevated functioning in polygenetic trait dimensions like intelligence, health, hardness, and appearance. Other potential biotechnological techniques might also be relevant. Human reproductive cloning, once achieved, of course, could be used to replicate the genome of exceptionally talented individuals. Uptake would be limited by the preference of most prospective parents to be biologically related to their children. Yet the practice could nevertheless come to have a non-negligible impact because even a relatively small increase in the number of exceptionally talented people might have a significant effect, and it's possible that some state will embark on a large-scale eugenics program, perhaps by paying surrogate mothers. Other kind of genetic engineering, such as the design of novel synthetic genes or insertion into the genome of promoter regions and other elements to control gene expression, might also become important over time. Even more exotic possibilities may exist, such as vats full of complexly structured cultured cortical tissue or uplifted transgenic animals. These latter ones are wholly speculative, but over a long time frame, they perhaps cannot be completely discounted. So far, we have discussed the germline interventions, ones that will be done on gametes or embryos. Somatic gene enhancements by passing the generation cycle could in principle produce impacts more quickly. However, they are technologically much more challenging. They require that one modifies genes be inserted into a large number of cells in the living body, including, in the case of cognitive enhancement, the brain. Selecting among existing egg cells, for example, or embryos, in contrast, requires no gene insertion. Even such germline therapies as do involve modifying the genome area are far easier to implement at the gamete or the embryo stage, where one is dealing with a small number of cells. Furthermore, germline interventions on embryos can probably achieve greater effects than somatic interventions on adults, because the former will be able to shape early brain development, whereas the latter would be limited to tweaking an existing structure. Focusing therefore on germline interventions, we must take into account that the generational lag delaying a large impact on the world. Even if the technology were perfected today and immediately put to use, it will take more than 2 decades for a genetically enhanced brood to reach maturity. Furthermore, with human applications, there is normally a delay of at least 1 decade between proof of concept in the laboratory and clinical application. Because of the need for extensive studies to determine safety. The simplest forms of genetic selection, however, could largely abrogate the need for such testing, since they would use standard fertility treatment techniques and genetic information to choose between embryos that might otherwise have been selected by just chance. Delays also could also results from obstacles rooted in a fear of failure, but in fear of success. Demand for regulation driven by concerns about the moral permissibility of genetic selections or its wider implications. Such concerns are likely to be more influential in some countries than in others, owing to different cultural, historical, and religious contexts. For example, post-war Germany, for example, has chosen to give wide berth to any reproductive practices that could be perceived to be even in the remotest way aimed at enhancement, a stance that is understandable given the particularly dark history of atrocities connected to the eugenics movement in Germany. Other Western countries are likely to take a more liberal approach and view, and some countries, for example, China, Singapore, both of which have long-term population policies, might not only permit but actively promote the use of genetic selection and genetic engineering to enhance the intelligence of their populations once the technology to do so is available. If we add up the various delays, so 5 to 10 years to gather the information needed for significantly effective selection among a set of IVF embryos, 10 years to build significant uptake, and 20 or 25 years for the enhanced generation to reach an age where they start becoming productive, we find that germline enhancements are unlikely to have a significant impact on society before the middle of this century. From that point onward, however, the intelligence of significant segments of the adult population may begin to be boosted by genetic enhancements, and the speed of the ascent will then greatly accelerate as cohorts conceived using more powerful next-generation genetic technologies enter the labor force. With the full development of genetic technologies described Already, it might be possible to ensure that new individuals are on average smarter than any human who has yet existed, with peaks that rise higher still. The potential of biological enhancement is thus ultimately high, probably sufficient for the attainment of at least weak forms of superintelligence. This should not be surprising. After all, some evolutionary processes have dramatically amplified the intelligence in the human lineage, even compared with our close relatives, the great apes and our humanoid ancestors. And there is no reason to suppose Homo sapiens to have reached the apex of cognitive effectiveness attainable in a biological system. Far from being the smartest possible biological species, we are probably better thought of as the stupidest possible biological species capable of starting a technological civilization. And niche we fill it because we got there first, not because we are in any sense optimally adapted to it. Progress along the biological path is clearly feasible. The generational lag in germline interventions means that progress could not be nearly as sudden and abrupt as in scenarios involving machine intelligence. The ultimate potential of machine intelligence is, of course, vastly greater than that of organic intelligence. One can get some sense of the magnitude of the gap by considering the speed differential between electronic components and nerve cells. Even today's transistors operate on a time scale 10 million times shorter than that of biological neurons. However, even comparatively moderate enhancements of biological cognition could have important consequences. And in particular, cognitive enhancement could accelerate science and technology, including progress toward more patent forms of biological intelligence application and machine intelligence. Just consider how the rate of progress in the field of artificial intelligence will change in a world where average Joe is an intellectual peer of Alan Turing or John von Neumann, and where millions of people hover far above an intellectual giant of the past. Well, a discussion of the strategic implications of cognitive enhancement will have to wait a later video, but I can summarize this section by noting these three conclusions. The first one is, at least, weak forms of superintelligence are achievable by means of biotechnological enhancements. The second one will be the feasibility of cognitively enhanced humans adds to the plausibility that advanced forms of machine intelligences are feasible, because even if we were fundamentally unable to create machine intelligence, which there is no reason to suppose, machine intelligence might still be within reach of cognitively enhanced humans. Third one, when we consider scenarios stretching significantly into the second half of this century and beyond, we must take into account the probable emergence of a generation of genetically enhanced populations, waters, inventors, scientists, with the magnitude of enhancement escalating rapidly over subsequent decades. Well, it is occasionally hypothesized that direct brain-computer interfaces, in particular in plants, might allow people to take advantage of the strengths of digital computing, like perfect memory, quick and accurate mass calculations, and high bandwidth data transmission, leading to a hybrid system that will perform noticeably better than the augmented brain. Also, direct brain-to-computer connections have been theorized. It's doubtful that widespread adoption of these interfaces or improvements will occur anytime soon. To begin with, there are significant risks of medical complications, including infections, electrode displacement, hemorrhage, and cognitive decline when implanting electrodes in the brain. Perhaps the most vivid illustration to the date of the benefits that can be obtained through brain simulation is the treatment of patients with Parkinson's disease. The Parkinson's implant is relatively simple. It does not really communicate with the brain, but simply supplies a stimulating electric current to the subthalamic nucleus. A demonstration video shows a subject slumped in a chair, completely immobilized by the disease, then suddenly springing to life when the current is switched on. The subject now moves his arms, stands up and walks across the room, turns around and performs a pirouette. Yet even behind this, especially simple and almost miraculously successful procedure, there lurks negatives. One study of Parkinson patients who had received deep brain implants showed reductions in verbal fluency, selective attention, color naming, and verbal memory compared with all kind of controls. Treated subjects also reported more cognitive complaints. Such risks and side effects might be tolerable if the procedure is used to alleviate severe disability. But in order for health to subjects to volunteer themselves for neurosurgery, there would have to be some very substantial enhancement of normal functionality to be gained. This brings us to the second reason to adopt that superintelligence will be achieved through cyborgization, namely that the enhancement is likely to be far more difficult than therapy. Patients who suffer from paralysis, for example, might benefit from an implant that replaces their severed nerves and activates spinal motion pattern generators. Patients who are deaf or blind, for example, might benefit from artificial cochleae and retinas. Patients with Parkinson's disease or chronic pain might benefit from deep brain stimulation that excites or inhibits activity in a particular area of the brain. What seems far more difficult to achieve is a high bandwidth direct interaction between brain and computer to provide substantial increases in intelligence of a form that could not be more readily attained by other means. Most of the potential benefits that brain implants could provide in health subjects could be obtained as far less risk, expense, inconvenience, by using regular motor and sensor organs to interact with computers located outside of our bodies. And we do not need to plug a fiber optic cable into our brains in order to access the internet. Not only can the human retina transmit data at an impressive rate of nearly, say, 10 million bits per second, but it comes prepackaged with a massive amount of dedicated wetware. The visual cortex, which is highly adapted to extracting meaning from this information torrent and to interfacing with other brain areas for further processing. Even if there were an easy way of pumping more information into our brains, the extra data inflow would do little to increase the rate at which we think and learn, unless all the neural machinery necessary for making sense of the data were similarly upgraded. Since this includes almost all of the brain, what will really be needed is a whole brain prosthesis, which is just another way of saying artificial general intelligence. If one had a human level AI, one could dispense with neurosurgery. A computer might as well have a metal casing as one of bone. So this limiting case just takes us back to the AI pass, which we have already examined together. Brain-computer interfacing has also been proposed as a way to get information out of the brain for purposes of communicating with other brains or with machines. Such uplinks have helped patients with locked-in syndrome to communicate with the outside world by enabling them to move a cursor on a screen by just a thought. The bandwidth attained in such experiments is very low. The patient painstakingly types out one slow letter after another at a rate of a few words per minute. One can readily imagine improved versions of this technology, like perhaps a next generation implant could plug into Broca's area and pick up internal speech. But while such a technology might assist some people with disabilities induced by stroke or muscular degeneration, it would hold little appeal for healthy subjects. The functionality it will provide is essentially that of a microphone coupled with speech recognition software, which is already commercially available, minus the pain, inconvenience, expense, and risk associated with neurosurgery. Keeping our machines outside of our bodies also makes upgrading easier. But what about the dream of bypassing words altogether and establishing a connection between two brains that enables concepts, thoughts, or just entire areas of expertise to be, say, downloaded from one mind to another? We can download large files to our computers, including libraries with millions of books and articles, and this can be done over the course of seconds. Could something similar be done with our brains? That's a very great question. The apparent plausibility of this idea probably derives from an incorrect view of how information is stored and represented in our brain. As noted, the rate limiting step in human intelligence is not how fast raw data can be fed into the brain, but rather how quickly the brain extracts meaning and makes sense of the data. Perhaps it will suggest that we transmit meanings directly rather than package them into sensor data that must be decoded by the recipient. There are two problems with this. The first is what brains, by contrast to the kinds of program we typically run on our computers, do not use standardized data storage and representation formats, but rather each brain develops its own idiosyncratic representations of high-level content. Which particular neuronal assemblies are recruited to represent that particular concept depends on the unique experience of the brain in question. Just as in artificial neural nets, meaning in biological neural networks is likely represented holistically in the structure and activity patterns of sizable overlapping regions, not in discrete memories as laid out in neat arrays. It would therefore would not be possible to establish a simple mapping between the neurons in one brain and those in another brain in such a way that thoughts could automatically slide over from one to other brain. In order for the thoughts of the one brain to be intelligible to another, the thoughts need to be decomposed and packaged into symbols according to some shared convention that allows the symbols to be correctly interpreted by the receiving brain. And this is the job of the language. In principle, one could imagine offloading the cognitive work of articulation and interpretation to an interface that would somehow read out the neural states in the sender's brain and somehow feed in a bespoke pattern of activation to the receiver's brain. But this brings us to the second problem with the cyborg scenario. Even setting aside the technical challenge of how to reliably read and write simultaneously all the information from perhaps billions of individually addressable neurons, creating the requisite interface is probably an AI complete problem. The interface would need to include a component able to map firing patterns in one brain onto semantically equivalent firing patterns in the other brain. The detailed multi-level understanding of the neural computational needed to accomplish such a task would seem to directly enable neuromorphic artificial intelligence. Despite these reservations, the cyborg road toward cognitive enhancement is not entirely without promise. Impressive work on the rat hippocampus, for example, has demonstrated the feasibility of a neural hypothesis that can be enhanced performance in a simple working like memory task. In its present version, the implant collects input from a dozen or two electrodes located in the area of the hippocampus and projects onto a similar number of neurons in another area. A microscoper is trained to discriminate between two different things, namely two different one is firing patterns in the first area, and the second is to learn how these patterns are projected into the second area. This prosthesis can not only restore function when the normal neural connection between the two neural areas is blockaded, but by sending an especially clear token of a particular memory pattern to the second area, it can enhance the performance on the memory task beyond what the rat is normally capable of. While a technical tour de force by contemporary standards, the study leaves many challenging questions unanswered, like how well does the approach scale to greater numbers of memories? How well can we control the combinatorial explosion that otherwise threatens to make learning the correct mapping infeasible as the number of input and output neurons is increased? And does the enhanced performance on the test task come at some hidden cost, such as reduced ability to generalize from the particular stimulus used in the experiment, or reduced ability to unlearn the association when the environment changes? And will the test subjects still somehow benefit, even if, unlike rats, they could avail themselves of external memory aids such as pen or paper? And how much harder would it be to apply a similar method to other parts of the brain? Whereas the present prosthesis takes advantage of the relatively simple feed, forward structure of parts of the hippocampus, other structures in the cortex involve convoluted feedback loops, which greatly increase the complexity of the wiring diagram and presumably the difficulty of deciphering the functionality of any embedded group of neurons. One hope for the cyborg robot is that our brain, if permanently implanted with a device connecting it to some external resource, will over time learn an effective mapping between its own internal cognitive states and the inputs it receives from, or the outputs accepted by the device. Then the implant itself would not need to be intelligent. Rather, the brain will intelligently adapt to the interface, much as the brain of an infant gradually learns to interpret the signals arriving from receptors in eyes, ears. But here again, one must question how much would really be gained. Suppose that the brain's plasticity were such that it could learn to detect patterns in some new input stream arbitrarily projected onto some part of the cortex by means of a brain, like computer interface. And here we have a question here. Why not project the same information onto the retina instead as a visual pattern, or onto the cochlea as sounds? The low-tech alternative avoids a thousand of complications, and in either case, the brain could deploy its pattern recognition mechanisms and plasticity to learn to make sense of all the information we have. Well, the steady improvement of networks and organizations that connect unique human minds with one another and with various artifacts and robots is another plausible road to superintelligence. The idea is not that this would increase people's intelligence to the point where they become superintelligent, but rather that some system made up of people who are thus networked and organized might achieve a type of superintelligence, which we will refer to as collective superintelligence in the following videos. Humanity has gained enormously in collective intelligence over the course of history and prehistory. The gains come from many sources, including innovations in communications technologies such as writing and printing, and above all, the introduction of language itself. Increases in the size of the world population and the density of habitation, various improvements in organizational techniques and epistemic norms, and the gradual accumulation of institutional capital. And in general terms, a system's collective intelligence is limited by the abilities of its members' mind, the overheads in the communicating relevant information between them, and the various distortions and inefficiencies that pervade human organizations. If communication overheads are reduced, then larger and more densely connected organizations become feasible. The same could happen if fixes are found for some of the bureaucratic deformations that wrap organizational life, wasteful stats games, mission creep, concealment, or falsification of information, and other agency problems. Even partial solutions to these problems could pay hefty dividends for collective intelligence. The technological and institutional innovations that could contribute to the growth of our collective intelligence are many and various. For example, subsidized prediction markets might foster truth-seeking norms and improve forecasting on contentious scientific and social issues. For example, lie detectors could reduce the scope for deception in human affairs. Self-deception detectors, for example, might be even more powerful, even without new flanked brain technologies. Some forms of deception might become harder to practice thanks to increased availability of many kinds of data, including reputations and track records, or promulgation of strong epistemic norms and rational culture. Voluntary and involuntary surveillance will amass vast amounts of information about human behavior. Social networking sites are already used by over 1 billion people to share personal details. And soon, these people might begin uploading continuous live recordings from microphones and video cameras, like I do now right now, embedded in their smartphones or computers or eyeglass frames. Automated analysis of such data streams will enable many new applications. Growth in collective intelligence may also come from more general organizational and economic improvements, and from enlarging the fraction of the world's population that is educated, digitally connected, and integrated into global intellectual culture. The internet stands out as a particularly dynamic frontier for innovation and experimentation. Most of its potential may still remain unexploited. Continuing development of an intelligent web with better support for deliberation, the biasing and judgment aggregation might make large contributions to increasing the collective intelligence of humanity as a whole or of particular groups. But what of the seemingly more fanciful idea that the internet might one day wake up? Could the internet become something more than just the backbone of a loosely integrated collective superintelligent, like something more like a virtual schoolhouse and emerging unified superintellect? Against this one cool object that machine intelligence is hard enough to achieve through arduous engineering, and that it's incredible to suppose that it will arise spontaneously. However, the story need not be that some future version of the internet suddenly becomes super intelligent by mere happenstance. A more plausible version of the scenario will be that the internet accumulates improvements through the network of many people over many years, like I'm speaking to the video and it's recorded in somewhere, and work to engineer better search and information filtering algorithms, more powerful data representation formats, more capable autonomous software agents, and more efficient protocols governing the interactions between such bots, and that myriad incremental eventually create the basis for some more unified form of web intelligence. It seems at least conceivable that such a web-based cognitive system, super saturated with computer power and all other sources need for explosive growth, save for one crucial ingredient, could, when the final missing constituent is dropped into the cauldron, blaze up with superintelligence. And this type of scenario, though, converts into another possible path to superintelligence, that of artificial general intelligence, which we have already discussed. We should be more optimistic that we will eventually achieve superintelligence, because there are numerous roads there. Even if one path ends up being blocked, we can still move forward. The existence of several paths does not imply the existence of several destinations. Machine intelligence would not become obsolete even if significant intelligent amplification was first attained along one of the non-machine intelligent paths. Contrarily, increased biological or organizational intelligence would speed up scientific and technological advancements, possibly bringing about the development of more radical methods of application of intelligence, such as whole brain emulation and artificial intelligence. This is not to imply that it doesn't matter how we achieve artificial superintelligence. The road taken to get there might have a significant impact on the result, even though the trajectory has little impact on the final capabilities attained. The specifics of our approach may have an impact on how those capabilities are used and how much control we humans have over their behavior. For example, improvements in biological or organizational intelligence might improve our capacity for risk prediction and safe and beneficial machine superintelligence design. True superintelligence might plausibly first be attained via the AI path. There are, however, many fundamental uncertainties along this path. This makes it difficult to rigorously assess how long the path is or how many obstacles there are along the way. The whole-brain emulation, for example, path also has some chance of being the quickest road to superintelligence. Personally, I believe this one will be the quickest road. I mean, whole-brain emulation. Since progress along this path requires mainly incremental technological advances rather than theoretical breakthroughs, a strong case can be made that it will eventually succeed. It seems fairly likely, however, that even if progress along the whole-brain emulation path is swift, artificial intelligence will nevertheless be first to cross the finishing line. This is because of the possibility of neuromorphic AIs based on artificial emulations. Biological cognitive enhancements are clearly feasible, particularly ones based on genetic selection. Iterated embryo selection currently seems like an especially promising technology. Compared with possible breakthroughs in machine intelligence, however, biological enhancements would be relatively slow and gradual. They would, at best, result in relatively weak forms of superintelligence. The clear feasibility of biological enhancement should increase our confidence that machine intelligence is ultimately achievable, since enhanced human scientists and engineers will be able to make more and faster progress than their natural counterparts, especially in scenarios in which machine intelligence is delayed beyond mid-century. The increasingly cognitively enhanced cohorts coming on stage will play a growing role in subsequent developments. Brain-computer interfaces look unlikely as a source of superintelligence. Improvements in networks and organizations might result in weakly superintelligent forms of collective intelligence in the long run, but more likely they will play an enabling role similar to that of biological cognitive enhancement, gradually increasing humanity's effective ability to solve intellectual problems. Compared with biological enhancements, advances in networks and organization will make a difference sooner. In fact, such advances are occurring continuously and having a significant impact already. However, improvements in networks and organizations may yield narrower increases in our problem-solving capacity than will improvements in our biological cognition, boosting collective intelligence rather than quality intelligence. To anticipate a distinction I'm about to introduce in the next video.